really cool pictures, tell you some stories of things, and probably if we told everything we could find, we'd be here for 3 or 4 hours, but we don't have enough donuts and coffee for that, so we'll go with what we got. So today, we're going to talk about April Fools in space. How many of you seen that movie? Kidding around in the cosmos. And if you haven't seen Galaxy Quest, that's a funny movie, especially if you were a fan of Star Trek. Galaxy Quest with Tim Allen is a nice parody on Star Trek. First thing I want to talk today is about the Aphrodite Project. How many of you are familiar with the Aphrodite Project? It actually supposedly happened in this area. And several years ago when I was writing a weekly This Week in Space History column, I found in this magazine right here, an Astounding Science Fiction, and this gentleman and I were talking about reading science fiction when we were really young, found in this magazine from June of 1949, you see right there at the bottom, the Aphrodite Project by Philip Latham. And the editor of this magazine was a man by the name of John Campbell Jr. If you're a science fiction aficionado, you probably know about John Campbell Jr. He shaped science fiction in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and I think died in somewhere in the early to mid 1970s. But he was very influential in that field. A lot of the folks who became big star writers in science fiction came in under John Campbell Jr.'s tutelage. So he edited this magazine, and the Aphrodite Project was all about Venus. You see Venus up there. I think that's a false color image of Venus. Mr. Latham, his real name was Robert Richardson. And if you're an astronomer, he was a very, very well-respected astronomer. He worked at Palomar, he worked at Mount Wilson, I believe in Southern California, outside of Los Angeles. He wrote a college textbook. He gave talks all over the world. So when one of his articles shows up in a magazine, people paid attention to it. He wrote science fiction, a lot of early kids science fiction, as I said, under the name of Philip Latham. So I found this article in this magazine right here, and I got to reading it, and it's all about two scientists who one day, he said, are standing in Southern California and they're looking at Venus. And obviously in the mid-1940s, there wasn't as much light pollution in Los Angeles as you find today. So as Mr. Richardson relates, and that's him up there on the right, these two scientists, they worked with computers, they were astronomers, they're looking at Venus over an all-night drugstore where they just had dinner at the deli. And they're thinking about Project Diana, which shot, I think, radar signals off of the moon. And they're lamenting, we know something about the moon, we know something about Mars, we don't really know a whole lot about Venus. And what they wanted to do was find what's known as the perturbations of Venus. I believe that's how you pronounce that. And that is the relationship of celestial bodies and orbital motion. As it happened, both of these gentlemen, astronomers, computer persons, the story said they worked at Columbia on some of the first punch cards in computers. They happened to have connections at White Sands Proving Ground, as luck would have it. So they devised this plan, and they took it to the Navy in Washington, D.C., and they laid out what they wanted to do. And the plan was that they would launch a satellite to Venus. It would have a dense liquid inside of it, and it would actually be contained in the warhead. They calculated that it would take 146 days to get to Venus. At that point, the warhead would release the liquid, it would form a dense cloud, and from its motion, wobbly motion, affected by Venus's gravity, according to the story, they would be able to calculate a number of things. Venus's mass, its perturbations, and several things that they were looking to find out. So they took this to the Navy, and the Navy had a facility at the time at White Sands, and the Navy said, yeah, we'll buy into this. So they went to White Sands Proving Grounds, and they launched the rocket. And sure enough, 146 days later, they were on top of a mountain down near White Sands, at an observatory someplace called Mosca, M-O-S-C-A. Had their telescopes trained. The story says they watched the rocket approach. Sure enough, warhead detonated. Out comes this liquid, forms a cloud, and they are just thrilled that their plan is working. And over the next 10 days, they calculated all of the information that they wanted. The mass, the perturbations. They just walked away with a wealth of data. The story, I believe, says they lived there, they slept there, they ate there for 10 days while they took advantage of this successful program. And of course, it was launched out at White Sands at Launch Complex 33, which is now a National Historical Monument.
What year was this?
This would have been about 1947, 1948.
Really?
Yeah. So what I did, these are actual shots, computer-generated models and data, and from a Russian probe on the Venusian surface. So these are actual shots of Venus. So I thought this is really cool. I'd like to find out more about this. And I called Lisa Blevins out of White Sands 3, which is now a national historic. Outlined the story just as I told you, and said, you guys have documentation of this. I'd like to do a piece for the space of actual shots of Venus. And I'm sure somewhere in your archives is documentation. And Lisa said, first I heard of that. But I'll do some research. So she called me back a few days later and said, there's absolutely nothing about anything called Project Aphrodite in our archives, and our archives are very extensive. This is John Campbell Jr. right here. So I didn't just want to drop it. I kind of wanted to find out what happened, and it took a while. It was like being a detective at the scene of the crime. 1949, the story was in the magazine, and I went through an online resource issue by issue by issue, and finally found this issue from August of 1960. And in the 1949 issue, John Campbell Jr. right there talks about the documentation as Philip Latham had, talks about the scientist's background, and in the 1960 issue, he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, ha ha, we lied. He said, however, in the current light of our space program, we now have the technology to do this, and we should be thinking farther out than just the moon. We could actually accomplish this and do what we said we were doing in 1949. I'm going to talk a little bit about John Campbell. How many are familiar with John Campbell? Yeah. John Campbell was not just a writer, an editor. He was also very, very outspoken. And for years, I had heard, when I was in school, we studied Sputnik, we studied the Cold War and the space race. For years, I had heard that Sputnik was a big secret. And according to John Campbell Jr., that was absolutely not the truth. In the January 1958 magazine, he wrote, well, we lost that race. Russian technology achieved an important milestone in human history, one the United States tried for, talked about a lot, and didn't make. He was very critical of the space program. He also said, various commentators have tried to gloss over the facts, ranging from efforts to demean the high accomplishment that Russians achieved to poo-pooing the importance of getting there first, saying sour grapes was recognized as an undesirable technique even in Roman times. He was not content to leave it at that. 2 months later, almost every picture you see, not all, but almost every one, John Campbell Jr. has a cigarette in his hand. 2 months later, he wrote, the Russians did the job the way it should have been done. Try it private before you start telling all the world what wonders you're going to produce. And then he went on to say, not only did Russia do a good job of research and development in their satellite, we did a poor job and have displayed an exceedingly supercilious attitude before the world. And there was some other things that he wrote about, but basically what he concluded was that he found documentation the Soviets were publishing in the newspapers and magazines in the Soviet Union features on all of these, how they were making advances in the Sputnik program. They even gave the radio frequencies where the ham and radio operators could listen to the frequency that Sputnik was put out after it was launched. So in this country, we were told, surprise to us, Campbell kind of pulled the rug out from under the government and said that the American government made the decision that what the Soviet Union was doing was not fit for the American reader to consume. Which basically put to rest that theory that Sputnik, and I was in high school in the early 1970s and was told it was a big secret. And imagine my surprise to find out that no, it wasn't. Everybody over there knew about it.
We heard about it in Germany.
Did you hear about it in Germany?
The U.S. government also told Werner von Braun's team who worked for the Army that they were not to put their satellite up.
Oh, really?
They could have done it 2 years earlier.
Wow.
Von Braun went to Congress several times, said, here's the vehicle, we have it, we can launch it. And they said, no, we want a civilian satellite. They had the Vanguard program.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yes.
After the Vanguard failed umpteen times, they told von Braun, go ahead. And within a few months, they launched the first satellite.
Yeah.
With technology that had been sitting on the shelf for years.
Yep. All right, let's talk about Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin was the second man to walk on the moon. And he coined the phrase magnificent desolation. He got out on the lunar surface, looked around the horizon, and coined the term magnificent desolation to describe what he saw. But Buzz did something else that I haven't been able to find any reference to any other of the astronauts that walked on the lunar surface having done. He took communion on the moon in the Lunar Module. He was sitting in there after Neil, I believe, got out, and he had made arrangements with his church. I don't think he told NASA. A lot of these astronauts did things they didn't tell NASA they were going to do, including Alan Shepard hitting the golf ball on the moon. He had this little cup and a little bit of the host, and he had a little bit of bread, and he said he poured the wine from a sealed container into the cup, and he just kind of sat there, and the 1/6 gravity didn't do much, but he took communion, and then he walked out onto the moon. Buzz Aldrin then says, besides coining magnificent desolation, taking communion on the moon, he said he did something else. This is a picture of Aldrin, picture of him doing his rescue trip. So Buzz says, quote, Neil might have been the first man to step on the moon, but I was the first man to pee in his pants on the moon. He said, I was, of course, linked up with the urine collection device. Now think about this as he's having his picture taking there, what's going on. He says, but it was a unique feeling. The whole world was watching, but I was the only one who knew what they were really witnessing. All right, there's a video. I got a couple videos here, and I've got one that I'd like to show you. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with conspiracy theorists. And we get folks in here, I've given a tour to a handful of people over 10 years who say, this is all fraud, it's a waste of taxpayer money, we never went to the moon.
Really?
Last one was about 3 years ago. It was a member of the German Air Force out of Holland who brought family through. And he kind of latched onto a tour I was giving. He said, you don't really believe this, do you? And for those folks, we point out, if you've ever watched Mythbusters, Mythbusters came to town a few years ago, went up to Apache Point and shot lasers at material we left on the moon and got readings back. You can find that episode online. They also, you can find pictures online that satellites take. You can still see the rover tracks. The reason I really believe we went to the moon, they landed when I was 12 years old. My grandfather, who'd been born in the late 1800s, came over. He'd grown up on a farm, seen cars come in, seen airplanes come in, jets come in, and he believed we went to the moon. It was good enough for him, it was good enough for me.
I didn't see it at all.
But there are conspiracy theorists, and you can find videos of conspiracy theorists confronting a lot of the moonwalkers, Neil Armstrong in public. Most of them just turn around and walk away. Not Buzz Aldrin.
Howdy, Buzz. How's it going? Remember me? What's your name? Mark Fiddler. Would you want to give your name to my associate? Yeah, I got one for you, one for your lawyer. Sue me. Okay, Michael. I'd love to get a quick shot. Let's go shot. something you didn't do. You're getting a lecture for walking on the moon when you didn't. That's called being a thief. That's called being a thief. Do you think you can get to heaven without repenting? Why don't you swear in the Bible that you walked on the moon?
He's probably 78, 79 years old at this point.
Get out of here. We believe in every case. Just the lack of ever thought of saying that. You forget it away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Great.
So this guy's probably in his 30s.
Was he prosecuted?
Not that I'm aware of. The internet says he's a cab driver who's made some short conspiracy films. Buzz is probably 78, 79 years old.
And there's a wannabe Michael Moore.
How many have been in the military? So you probably know that once a warrior, always a warrior.
Call him a kettle black if ever thought of saying that. You forget it away from me. You're a coward and a liar.
Okay. Got a couple more videos I'll show here after a while. So that's Buzz Aldrin. Of course, the conspiracy theory is that it was all done in a Hollywood movie studio, and some of you may remember in the 70s the O.J. Simpson movie Capricorn 1, about they played the astronauts in the movie studio and the government chased them all down and killed them because they wouldn't tell the truth. So there's a representation right there. And I like this. It says, only a moron would think we fired 12 of these monsters just for show. All right, since we're kind of, yes?
Just an observation.
Yeah.
Proofs abound where they convinced.
Very true.
George Will.
Yep. All right, this is Theo Harrison, since we're kind of talking some things with human conditions in space. Theo Hara was the Mercury nurse. If you watched All the Right Stuff, you know some of the frustrating things that they went through. And so all 7 of those astronauts, this is a picture of Theo Hara. Guess what they gave to Theo Hara? Who wants to take a guess as to what's in that container? All 7 of them donated. Yes. And one more video. You do know that because of the they now actually recycle that in space and drink it. And let me pull up the other video.
And then here we go. And here's to you guys, and here's to everybody who made this all happen.
The Expedition 19 crew inaugurating the use of the water recovery system to produce recycled, purified water.
I think the guy sounds like a golf tournament announcer. All right. Brad, I thought you'd like this. Weren't you with Strategic Air Command? Yeah. Brad was with SAC.
Not under him, no.
Not under him?
He was retired.
General LeMay was a warrior. He actually led his men into combat in flight. Very, very controversial. And I think it was 1968, I want to say, he was actually vice presidential candidate to George Wallace, which nobody ever really understood why he did that. Just kind of sullied his reputation if you read what the commentators had to say. But I want to talk about RASCAL. RASCAL is an acronym for Radar Scanning Link, R-A-S-C-A-L. And this is a RASCAL being deployed in the upper right. This is a RASCAL in the lower left that we have out at the New Mexico Museum of Space History's boneyard out in our Museum Support Center. And I think here in 3 months when we do our next tour out there, we just did one last Saturday, there's every possibility that you can see that. It's waiting out there to be restored. It was the world's first nuclear missile. It was known as the supersonic pilotless parasite bomber. And it was air to ground. It weighed 13,000 pounds. 35 feet long, carried 293 gallons of fuel. It could carry a 3,000 to 5,000 pound warhead. 3 rockets each produced 6,000 pounds of thrust for a total of 18,000 pounds. It would climb to 50 to 60,000 feet, get within 20 miles of the target, turn 30 degrees, and hit its target at speeds of Mach 1.5 to 2.5. How did it do that? Very simply, in that era, it had to have an operator. Not like the movie where, what's his name, sits on the bottom of the Slim Pickens, yeah, Dr. Strangelove. But the operator sat inside the bomber after it was deployed and controlled it. They had control of it. And so they proved its worthiness. It went to Strategic Air Command, which created a division just for the rascal. And it was there for about a year. Very successful, until somebody said, you know, if the enemy were a few miles away and they had an operator on board and the right radio frequencies, they could take control of it and neutralize it or turn it back on us.
Yeah, I'll be back down tomorrow.
That was the end of the rascal. So it was decommissioned and sacked, and I don't know what happened to a lot of them. We at least fortunately have one in our inventory. How many of you are familiar with Operation Smoke Puff? Now that did happen in this area. Unlike Aphrodite, Smoke Puff actually occurred. And one of the things I like to do when I go places, I find thrift stores and I look for old magazines. They're pretty cheap, to see if there are any space-related stories inside that might be kind of interesting. And I found I have this Popular Mechanics magazine, this particular issue right here, and it has an article, and if you're interested in it, it's on Google Books. You can Google Operation Smoke Puff, Popular Mechanics, and actually read the story inside it on the internet. Smoke Puff was tested out here at Holloman Air Force Base, and it was launched in an Hihi, is what they were known as. The goal was, we were trying in this era, and this would have been in the mid-1950s, in the Cold War, we were trying to figure out how we could bounce radio signals to our allies or to our servicemen, even submarines. They wanted to be able, anywhere in the country, any location where there was a military base, to bounce a radio signal to a submarine. And so their way of doing it was that they put a sodium concoction liquid into the Hihi warhead, launched it, and deployed this cloud. And you know what? It worked. They were able to bounce signals all different places. They released it, ham radio operators participated. I think they tested it up in Washington. They also tested it out here over the Tularosa Basin. And it was very, very successful. So they did it during the day because that's when they could ionize with the conditions, the sun, everything else. That's when they could actually ionize the cloud. And somebody suggested, in the era right after Sputnik, why don't we deploy this cloud over our military bases, over our major cities that might be prone to be spied on by the Sputnik satellite or other Soviet satellites, or set us up to be a target by the Soviet Union. And as the satellite is going over, we know it bounces radio signals from the bottom and goes to its destination. As the satellites go over, they will send their radar signals out, it will bounce off, and nothing will show up. It's a great idea. So out here over the Tularosa Basin, they launched an Operation Hihi. They deployed the sodium cloud, created a vapor, and that's when they learned that at night, these clouds tend to glow. And if you're trying to hide something, a glowing cloud over your Air Force base is not what you want. So that was the end of Operation Smoke Cloud.
Did I make a comment about Rascal?
Yes,
Previous?
sure.
I worked at Rocketdyne in 64, 65. In 65, there was a problem with this. The radar couldn't see through the metallic plume of the...
Oh, really?
The propellant had metal in it, so they had problems with the radar.
Yeah.
And so in 1965, Rocketdyne was developing rockets motors that did not have metal.
Oh, wow.
For air-to-air combat.
Yeah.
On the same topic, Rascal, LeMay, wasn't he the man who was kind of made a parody in Dr. Strange?
Yes, he was. Yep. Yep.
On that same subject, I worked at Vandenberg at a guidance station, and the solid rocket motors on the satellites that we put up, it also blocked our radar.
Oh, did it really?
What we had to do is we had a telescope on the side and an operator. And when the thing pitched over and the plume of aluminum blocked the radar, the operator was to reacquire the satellite so we could continue to guide it.
What years were those?
I was working there at 67 to 75, and that program continued for another 10 years. It was read on the internet. This is the WECO guidance station. It started about 10 years before I was there. I was there for 6 years, and then it went for another 10.
You guys need to come do oral histories with us.
I built a 36-inch telescope in Washington.
All right, next up on our list, and Wayne Madsen. Some of you may have known Wayne Madsen. He was an incredible font of information. A graduate, I believe, of the Naval Academy, went into the new Air Force, flew secret missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail during Vietnam, actually was shot at, and the ammunition pierced his plane, lodged itself in his lungs, and they were never able to take it out because it would have killed him. But you could ask him just about anything. If he didn't know it, which was rare when he didn't know it, he could find it for you in a few minutes. So Wayne was telling me one day about rockets and missiles that went awry. And I think we used to put out a publication years ago, and you wrote a two-part story on that. We all know the story about the V-2s after World War II, some of the first launches. 2 of them went off base. One of them hit the side of the mountain out here. And if any of you know, Robert Calloway was a fighter pilot, owned a tire store in town, was a city commission. He was 16 years old when that V-2 exploded around Gordo, hit the mountainside here, and in his oral history with us, he says that people came up there and stole a lot of secret things before the military from White Sands was able to respond, and including secret cameras. And he says that by midnight, the military went door to door and they got back every one of their secret parts. Another one went over the border and hit a cemetery outside of Juarez, left a 50-foot crater. By the time the military got down there, as the story goes, there was a guy, very ambitious guy, who was selling tickets to see the American missile. And parts disappeared, which were never gotten back. In addition, there was a headline in the newspaper, something to the effect of U.S. declares war on Mexico. So probably that technically would be the first intercontinental ballistic missile.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
When you're done with this story, I'd like to add something.
Okay. This particular story right here involves a missile that was launched, I believe, from White Sands Missile Range. And it went over the border, deep into Mexico. And it was one of those tests where they were releasing a cloud and testing the effects. Whether it went where it wasn't supposed to go, I haven't been able to find out. My suspicion is it went where it was not supposed to go, deep into Mexico. As it so happens, in a little church in Mexico, there was a priest there who happened that night to be preaching hellfire and damnation. And he had a very small crowd in his church. Service is over, they walk up, they look up, and there's this cloud in the sky. So the priest makes a few phone calls. He finds out what the problem was. Next night, there wasn't an empty seat in that church. Yes, you're hit.
I think I'd like to get your references as it ties into what I'm going to read.
Okay.
First of all, I'll identify myself. My name is Randall Steinhoff, and I worked for a little over 25 years out of White Sands Missile Range. And I don't remember what year it was, but I went on a tour, on one of the public tours, and we went out to LC-33. And while we were in the blockhouse, I asked the public affairs rep who was giving the tour at the time if he was familiar with Dr. Ernst Steinhoff.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, yeah. He said, tell you what, when we get out to the gantry, I'm going to relate the story, and then you'll know who I'm talking about. He was talking about he was referring privately to me, but he did not publicly in the briefing, to this mishap, and Dr. Ernst Steinhoff was the guidance expert on the V2 program. One of the guys that came over with Werner von Braun in Operation Paperclip. And so he was single-handedly responsible for that mishap.
Was he really?
Yeah.
Wow. So are you related to Hans?
I don't know, and I was going to ask if I was going to wait until after we were done to ask if you knew Hans.
Yeah, Hans lives up in Conrad.
And if he was still alive, because I haven't seen him for several years.
He's in the phone book.
Yeah.
I have some. We'll talk. So that's that story, and just for fun, let's see.
Landmark tests include the first high-altitude flight, first
Talking about the
separation of
V2
Earth's
here.
dome, and first view of the Earth's surface from outer space. The V2 has an overall length of 46 feet, a diameter of 5 feet 5 inches, and a fin span of 11 feet 8 inches. Its motor developed 5,200 pounds of thrust for 68 seconds, and its launching weight was over 2,800 pounds. The first V2s were launched from the missile range. Other rockets fired from this launching area were the Tiny Tim, a small rocket booster, Whack Corporal, an unguided rocket used for high-altitude research, and the Bumper, the first two-stage rocket.
Okay, hang on.
Other missiles or rockets which had their debut at this site were the Corporal, the Viking, and the Nike Ajax missile. These rockets.
So they don't always go where they're supposed to go.
One of the reasons why that real estate is so valuable.
Yeah. Joe Kittinger. Who does not know the story of Joe Kittinger? I'm sure everybody's met. Joe Kittinger basically was a test pilot out at Holloman Air Force Base, worked with Dr. John Stapp, and did the man-high flights in late 50s, and then the Excelsior flights where he jumped out of the balloon 3 times and survived all 3 of them. First one almost killed him. Last one had a problem where his blood filled, pressurized, and he couldn't maneuver it, so he couldn't cut off his data pack, weighed more than 300 pounds when he landed. Now this particular shot right here is from the first man-high. There were 3 man-high pilots, Kittinger, Dave Simons, and Demi McClure. And Demi was born the night, and we have a display up on the 3rd floor. Demi was born the night that Roosevelt was first elected president, and his family were Democrats, so he had they actually gave him the nickname at birth, Demi. This is a man-high capsule right there. They were flown out of, they weren't flown out of here. The jumps were, but the first man-high flights were not. They went to Minnesota where they could launch in a deep open pit mine to avoid winds and have the balloon already inflated by the time they took off at ground level. This capsule is at the National Museum of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And I took that several years ago, and if you've ever been there, if you want to see everything, it will take you 3 to 4 days to go through it. We had 5 hours. And I'd heard that this capsule was there, and I wanted to see it and take a picture of it. And so, you know, went through all the displays, finally got to the last building, got to the last room, and there's this huge intercontinental ballistic missile there, and I don't see the man-high capsule. So I asked the guide, and he said, well, walk behind, and there's a little corridor there, and you can walk to the very back corner, and that's where that poor capsule sits. Unless you don't know it, you're never going to see it. So there's a view of the inside right there. And the story I want to tell about Kittinger on this particular mission right there, we've all heard that on his ascent, his radio quit working. And so he had to go back to using Morse code. And he was able to communicate back and forth. When he got to altitude, something went wrong with the valve. All his oxygen vented out into the atmosphere. He realized it and immediately started a descent. And it took a little while for the ground crew to figure out what was going on. And when they realized it from instrumentation, he was losing his oxygen, they tapped descent immediately. Well, by this time, he's already doing it. And the jokester that Kittinger was, he tapped back, come up and get me. Stapp was not happy about that. But I found in an old edition of the Alamogordo Daily News a report quoting Stapp about this particular mission. And one time I met Kittinger out at Holloman Air Force Base, and I asked him about that, and he said, no, that never happened. But here's what the Alamogordo Daily News quoted John Stapp saying. First of all, they describe how the radio didn't work, and it was down at his feet, so he can't see it. He's kind of blind when he's trying to tune it in. Stapp said that Kittinger tuned to what he thought was the communications frequency. Stapp says that what he actually dialed was a commercial broadcasting station in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. And his freak chance, and I'm quoting it here, his freak chance would have it, the station wasn't on the air yet, but shortly after Kittinger left the Earth began its regular day's broadcasting. He's at 20,000 feet when they play the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem, which is what most stations sign on.
Yeah.
So you're a military guy, you're ascending, first time ever playing the Star Spangled Banner. Obviously you can't stand up in that capsule, but that's kind of cool. It gets to 90,000 feet, and the station played Nearer My God to Thee. Kittinger said he doesn't remember that happening. That's what the newspaper said. So, I don't know. Neil Armstrong, we know Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. He was supposed to say that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He was so nervous he left out the A. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
There's a static glitch on the E. That's why it was left out. So they say.
Oh, was it? Well, Pete Conrad, who was the third man on the moon, and if you don't know about Pete, Pete had dyslexia. He was kicked out of school in the 11th grade. His mother wouldn't accept that. She found him another school, helped him devise a sense of learning, and this was in the 40s, so, you know, they thought you were stupid at the time. They didn't understand. He graduated last in his class, got an ROTC scholarship to Princeton, I believe it was, because when he was growing up, he would do chores for people he knew were pilots, and rather than get paid, they took him flying as his recompense. So he got an ROTC scholarship, graduated near the bottom of his class, but of course he's the third man to walk on the moon, first man to command Skylab, and he flew the Delta Clipper in the mid-90s out here at Holloman Air Force Base, or White Sands Missile Range. So Neil Armstrong, that was his words. The Lunar Module, where they were supposed to touch down, they got there, they looked out, and it was full of boulders. Armstrong realized we can't land here, we'll crash, we'll never get off. So he took manual control from the computer, flew a little bit farther, landed in what's known as the Sea of Tranquility, and had about 15 seconds worth of fuel left. Conrad, who was known for his sense of humor, decided that he was going to get back at Neil. Their whole goal was to pick a spot where they knew they could land, touch down there, and so they picked a spot near, I think it was Surveyor 3, and landed. Conrad's first words, whoopee, man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. And as you can see, in that Surveyor in the background, or that's the Lunar Module in the background, but he walked 2 football field lengths to the Surveyor. So they were able to prove, it was a little contentious, I think, between the astronauts, well, you didn't land where you were supposed to, but we did. This is kind of a cute little story. You may recognize Ed White over here on the left, first American to walk in space, Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee. Of course, they all lost their lives in the Apollo 1 flight. But there was a code system that NASA used with the astronauts, and on this particular mission, the code for Gamma Cassiopeia was Navi. The code for Ursa Majoris was Denoces, and the code for Gamma Velorum was Regor. Now, all of these were stars. The astronauts had to be able to guide by the stars with a sextant if their navigation system went out. And we have an inertial guidance display on the 3rd floor, parts of which have actually been in space, including aboard Apollo 13. So I encourage you to go look at that. Anybody notice anything here? What's that? Navi is Ivan. Yep.
Roger.
Ivan is Grissom's middle name. Denoces backwards is second. White was second in command. And Regor, Roger, yep, was Chaffee's name. And NASA continued to use those for a long time after their deaths in commemoration to those astronauts that gave their lives in the Apollo mission program. But it was kind of an inside joke for years, these code names and where they actually came from and what they actually meant. What does Apollo 8 have to do with a woman sitting on a bed? Apollo 8, as you know, was the first Apollo mission to go to the moon. They didn't land, but they orbited the moon. And Bill Anders took the first time Humanized had ever seen the Earth rise above the planet Earth. Now he says, and it was printed on a 6-cent postage stamp, he says he actually took it vertically, but it's always been printed horizontally. Apollo 8 wanted to do something special to commemorate the first time man went to the moon. And they didn't know what to do. Borman had a friend who worked at NASA, and they were discussing what they should do, and somebody suggested, why don't you read from the Bible? So this friend of Borman said, well, I don't have a Bible. And his wife said, yes, we do. It's in such and such a drawer. It's the one you stole from the hotel that time we went to such and such. And his friend said, well, I don't know where to go. And his wife said, why don't you go to the beginning and read from Genesis? So it was this was a huge secret. They didn't tell anybody. So they get around Christmas Eve in 1968, and they start, the three of them take turns, and they read from the book of Genesis. Madeline Murray O'Hare, who was responsible for suing to get prayer out of school, decided that she didn't like this. And she got a petition of 28,000 signatures. That is a lot of signatures. 28,000 signatures, and went to court to sue that astronauts and any government worker, for that matter, could not express their faith on the job. 28,000 signatures. Over the next year, 2.5 million people wrote to NASA and said, we support the astronauts and government workers being able to do that, express their faith. The judge looked at that and threw it out of court. That's why you hear about prayer, but you don't hear about this. What does the Eiffel Tower have to do with space? In 1989, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Eiffel Tower, there was a contest to submit ideas on how that 100th anniversary could be commemorated. The one that won was from the European Space Agency. They called it the Ring of Light. They were going to launch a half-ton payload on a French Ariane rocket, unfurl it to form a string of 100 reflectors, and every 90 minutes, as it orbited the Earth, any place on the Earth, you could see the sun reflected in those reflectors. That's the one that won. It would measure 15 miles in circumference and orbit continually at an altitude of 500 miles. Some of the runner-ups were a curved reflecting sail that would focus the sun into a rotating cross with a bright center that you'd be able to see wherever it happened to be in orbit on Earth anytime. And the other runner-up was the Celeste Corporation in Florida was going to launch the created remains of 15,000 people in 150 kilogram satellites that would orbit the North and South Poles, so that those orbiting, their families could look up and see their loved ones' remains in space for the rest of their lives. You never heard of this actually happening because it didn't. Astronomers raised a huge stink that this would shut down the ability to see faint nebula millions of light years away, and the environmentalists protested because they said nobody has the right to change our environment without a study by a multinational group. So 1989 came and went, and that proposal went nowhere. Now, I think this is next to last story. Charlie Duke on the left. Charlie Duke walked on the moon. John Young walked on the moon. I believe that was Apollo 16. Charlie Duke was Capcom on Apollo 11. He's the one you hear going, you got a bunch of guys about to turn blue down here. That's Charlie Duke's voice. He was here a few years ago. Nicest guy in the world, lives in East Texas, over near Fredericksburg. And on Apollo 6, and he left that picture of his family on the moon right there. Took that photograph and dropped it, and there you see Charlie's footprint. So Young holds the record for the most liftoffs. I think 5 from Earth and 1 from the moon. So he has a total of 6 liftoffs that no other astronaut from either Earth or the moon has. On Apollo 16, there had been problems on 11, 12, 14, and 15 with astronauts losing potassium. So NASA devised a system where besides their water tube, they had a tube with some kind of orange concoction. I don't think it was Tang, but some type of orange concoction that would feed them potassium. While they were on the moon, those systems malfunctioned. At least they malfunctioned in John Young's helmet. And all these little orange bubbles started to float around. They got in his hair. They created a mess. It was very frustrating to him. And so he was complaining to Charlie Duke while they were standing there on the moon, thinking that they just had communications between the two of them. He said, I haven't, and this is a quote, I haven't eaten this much citrus fruit in 20 years, and I'll tell you one thing, in another 12 expletive deleted days, I ain't never eating any more oranges. End quote. Mission Control comes on and says, John, you know you have a hot mic. The entire world heard that. Yes. Our last subject is John Stapp, and he's published a couple books on puns and poems. Here are some. Jack Sprat was cholesterol fat, his wife vegetarian lean. They were fatally smashed when their pickup truck crashed, so what did their diet mean? endless dilemma of the news editor: does the report come from the horse's mouth or from the other end of the horse? Fanatical game warden wouldn't eat poached eggs. And something that seems really apropos today: you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time. That is enough to keep most crooked politicians in business most of the time.
True story.
Yes. But I wanted to highlight something really quickly. We're probably all familiar with the work he did on the sleds. We have a sled track out there, 632 miles an hour, 5 seconds, dead stop, 1.4 seconds. Helped develop equipment to keep pilots safe. And he's flying a T-33 from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Colorado to speak at the American Rocket Society. And I can't remember exactly what year this was, but I believe it was in the early 1960s. The T-33 has a flame out, and the engine goes down, and the pilot tells him, eject. This is the equipment he's wearing. In the 8-9 years earlier, he tested on this rocket sled we have out here. And he ejects, he lands safely, no problems. Wind grabs his parachute, drags him across the ground, and he breaks his ankle. But he basically walked away. Unfortunately, the pilot, in waiting for Stapp to eject and making sure Stapp safely ejected, by that time they were too low to the ground, and the pilot ejected, but he didn't survive. But the irony is that here's this man, most people who test things never think that what they tested and created they're actually going to have to use in some time in their life, but Dr. John Stapp did. So I trained years for space, and all I got for dinner were gummy worms. That's our presentation. If anybody else has anything you'd like to add to it or any questions, it's April Fool's, so I don't know the answer, I'll lie, and I'll tell you I'll lie.
Armstrong.
Yeah.
I don't know the complete story, but something about when he was a teenager, he heard his neighbors, I think he knocked a baseball over to their yard. He went over there and he heard his neighbors, the man and wife, arguing, and the woman told the man that she wouldn't do that until the teenage boy next door walks on the moon. And one of the things he said on the moon was, "This is for you, Mr. Kilpatrick."
Oh, really?
Nobody knew what that meant.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and hope you're a little more knowledgeable.
I was out there talking to somebody.
So I guess I'll get a hold of
Good, how are you doing?